7 signs an avoidant begins to collapse when you stop chasing them. This is for the hearts who once chased love in silence and are now learning how to return home to themselves. Have you ever loved someone you had to hold on to tightly, yet they never really came close? You tried a little harder, texted first again, stayed patient, understanding, hopeful. But the more you gave, the more they pulled away. The more you loved, the quieter they became. This isn't a coincidence. You're not too sensitive. You're caught in an anxious-avoidant emotional loop where one person unconsciously fears closeness and keeps pushing away, and the other ends up doing more just to feel loved. But then, one day, you stop running. You stop convincing someone to stay. And something strange happens. The avoidant begins to falter. They grow confused, unsettled, maybe even reach out without knowing why. In this video, we'll explore 7 unmistakable signs that an emotionally avoidant person starts to unravel quietly when they realize you're no longer the one who chases. They won't say it out loud, but their eyes, their timing, the way their silence starts to tremble, it all reveals something breaking inside. If you've ever loved someone, distant, felt rejected, but never understood why, this video is for you. Subscribe if you're ready to heal at the root, not by winning, but through inner peace. And stay until the end. Because once you understand what's really happening inside an avoidant, you won't want to chase anymore. You'll want to return to yourself. Sign 1. The empath's awakening when loving an avoidant. What makes loving an avoidant person so painful isn't the rejection, it's the absence, the coldness, the quiet, subtle withdrawal that doesn't look like cruelty but feels like starvation. The empath doesn't even realize when the loop begins. Because at first, everything feels peaceful. They fall for someone who seems deep, independent, low maintenance, but soon every attempt at closeness starts to feel too much for the avoidant. Simple questions become pressure. Natural needs for connection feel like threats. And the empath wanting to love right starts to shrink themselves. They hold back, soften their voice, make themselves easier to love, less demanding, all in hopes that the other person will stay. That's when the real self-abandonment begins. Avoidants don't set out to harm, but they genuinely don't know how to hold intimacy. Their nervous system reads closeness as danger, so they retreat, but never clearly. They still text, but coldly, still meet up, but distantly. They show up, but they're never really there. And the empath begins to wonder, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe if I love more safely, they'll trust me. So they love harder, become more patient, give more than they have, not realizing they're trying to make up for someone else's fear with their own depletion. Until one day, a silence, a cold comment, a vague deflection breaks something inside the empath. Not out of pain, but because they finally wake up. They wake up from the role of the healer, from the illusion that enough love will unlock someone's heart, from the quiet belief that they're not worthy of being fully loved. And they realize no one should have to prove their worth just to be loved. No one should carry the weight of connection alone. And love is not about saving someone from their fear. From that moment, they stop asking, why won't they choose me? Because they've chosen themselves. Sign 2. They withdraw when you're no longer chasing. But the moment the empath chooses themselves isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something deeper. The silence reverses. Before, it was always the empath who texted first, reached out, apologized, initiated warmth. They held the emotional rhythm. And the avoidant, used to someone always holding the connection cord, never had to be responsible for emotional closeness. But now that the empath has stopped initiating, something different happens. The avoidant begins to withdraw even more. They become quieter, more absent, not with confident detachment, but with confused silence. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to approach. They're unsure if they should even reach out because deep down they've never really learned how to navigate closeness without the other person leading it for them. This distance isn't a strategy, it's a consequence. The result of no longer having someone guiding them through the discomfort. The one who used to do that has stopped. And here's the truth, they won't admit. They don't know how to love when no one else is doing the work for them. No one's opening the conversation. No one's softening the edge. No one's pulling them close when they pull away. For the avoidant, emotions have always been vague, intimidating territory. They've learned to survive by disconnecting from their needs, from others, from vulnerability. They think they're fine when the relationship goes quiet. But in reality, they're only skilled at being silent, not at being inside the silence. And when the empath stops sending signals, that silence no longer feels safe. It starts to feel empty. It exposes a kind of loneliness they've always denied. I don't need anyone. I'm better alone. Distance makes me strong. But this time, no one clings to that distance. No one interprets the silence for them. No one fixes the disconnection. And that unnerves them. Not because they were abandoned, but because the quiet control they once had is broken. And you can feel it, not through their words, but through the strange energy of their absence. Their silence no longer holds power. It's become a void filled with confusion. They might suddenly drop a vague message, an open-ended story, a casual emoji, not because they want real connection, but because they're testing if you're still there. But you, the one who's returned to yourself, no longer responds the same way. You don't untangle the awkwardness anymore. You don't fill the gap. You no longer run towards someone who never learned how to hold you. And that terrifies them in silence. Sign 3. They feel empty, but can't name it. You thought they'd disappear completely once you stopped reaching out. But no, when no one is holding the emotional rhythm anymore, the avoidant doesn't fully leave. They just step halfway back, but never forward. They don't vanish, but they don't really return. Instead, they begin to reappear vaguely. A random like after weeks. A cryptic story. A message that says, "How have you been?" but leads nowhere. Because when you stopped initiating, the emptiness inside them finally echoed loud enough to be heard. They've never truly learned how to sit in emotional emptiness because they've spent a lifetime avoiding it. And now, with you, once they're bridged to safety, no longer reaching out, they don't know where to place their feet. They want you to respond, but they can't fully show up. They don't want to lose you, but they're not ready to be close either. So they resort to what they know, staying vaguely present, just enough to be remembered, but never enough to be trusted. This is the phase where the empath is most vulnerable, because you still care. You still want to believe something is shifting. But deep down, they haven't really changed. They're just trying to fill the space you left without walking through it. The avoidant in this moment isn't afraid of losing you as a person. They're afraid of losing your role in their emotional survival system. You were once the one who made them feel connected without them needing to face their emotions. Now, without you, they're forced to face themselves, and it disorients them. So they try to pull you back, but lack the maturity to hold you. They don't say, "I miss you." They post vague quotes about being misunderstood. They don't say, "I'm lost." They send a funny meme, a sad song, a poetic post about someone who left. They can't name the emptiness, but it leaks out in their scattered presence, their half signals, their silent cries. And you, once their translator, aren't playing anymore. You don't decode their messages. You don't soften their edges. You don't engage in half-hearted connections. And that's when they panic for real. Because the space they once used to maintain silent control has become real emptiness. There's no one holding the line, no one absorbing the emotional weight for them. They can't name what's hollow inside, so they try to make you say it through reaction, pity, or hope. But you've stopped. You're no longer the source. And this relationship is no longer a refuge for avoidance. And for the first time, they don't know what to do with themselves. Sign 4. When they no longer control the connection through silence. The emptiness the avoidant couldn't name doesn't just confuse them, it begins to destroy their most familiar weapon, silence. For them, silence was never random. It was how they kept distance without having to say, "I'm pulling away." It was how they avoided emotion without taking responsibility for the pain it caused. It was how they controlled intimacy by making you question, worry, and chase clarity. Silence for the avoidant was unspoken control. A soft domination not through aggression, but through strategic withdrawal. As long as you were still reacting, texting, wondering, they still felt like they held the rope. But then you stopped. You no longer reached out. You didn't ask what's going on. You didn't try to resuscitate a connection you couldn't carry alone. And that's when something happened they never expected. They lost control over the silence. The grip they once had through pulling back yet keeping your attention stopped working. And this is what quietly terrifies the avoidant. Their own defense mechanism has turned against them. Silence is no longer a safe place. It becomes a door closed from both sides. No one's knocking anymore. No one's translating emotions for them. No one's standing between them and their soft, hidden interior. You, the one who used to be the emotional cushion between them and their fear, are no longer there. And this doesn't just disorient them, it completely fractures their sense of emotional control. They might start retreating more, pretending to be busy, or acting even colder, not because they're fine, but because they don't know what else to do. They might look detached, but inside is a flood of unfamiliar reactions. Why aren't you asking how I am? Why aren't you reacting? Why does my silence now lead to actual emptiness? And slowly, their biggest fear becomes real. Silence no longer brings you back. It no longer controls, it isolates. What was once a tug of war is now a broken cord. No more tension, no more pull. They don't know how to approach without losing their defense system. But they also can't stand the stillness that's now swallowing them whole. Because the truth is, they didn't just rely on you as a partner. You were their emotional translator, the bridge between them and the parts of themselves they refused to meet. Now the bridge is gone, and they never learned how to swim. Sign Hamesh, when they try to become like you to reconnect, when silence no longer works, and withdrawal doesn't pull you back like it used to, the avoidant enters a new phase. They start trying to reconnect, not fully, but experimentally. The quiet collapse inside them has grown too loud to ignore. So they begin to take small steps toward you, but not with an open heart, with a simulation of emotional growth. You'll see it in their words. They begin to say things like, I'm trying to understand myself more. I think I've had trouble with closeness. I'm working on opening up. It sounds like change. But if you listen closely, you'll feel it. They're not sharing to rebuild. They're sharing to test if you're still there. Their vulnerability doesn't carry the weight of real courage. There's no action behind it, no consistency, no clear direction. It feels more like they're repeating your old language, as if mimicking emotional depth will bring you back without them having to go deeper themselves. This is a safe experiment, not a commitment. They don't say, I've done the inner work and I want to do this differently. They say, I'm reading about healing too. Or, I understand why you pulled away. I do. But you know now, through intuition, experience, and the emotional clarity you gained during your silence, that this is not yet someone who can meet you where you are. You don't react like before. You don't open your heart instantly. You don't grasp at the emotional crumbs they toss your way, because you've walked deep enough to know the difference between a real reach and a safe rehearsal. Your clarity makes you keener, calmer, slower to move. Not cold, just steady. And that your warm but grounded stillness unsettles them even more. Avoidants are not used to people who don't chase but also don't punish. They're used to two types, those who pursue them and those who cut them off. But now you do neither. You simply stand in awareness, and that forces them to face themselves with no one left to buffer the discomfort. They may start mimicking you, reading what you read, using words you used, sharing the ideals you once held. Not because they've transformed, but because they don't know how to truly connect other than copying how you once loved them. You see this. You don't judge it. But you also don't step back in. You no longer need to repeat the same test, because this time, you already have the answer. Sign 6. When they see you peaceful without them, and this is the moment when they tried to look grown, yet still couldn't come close, that something new begins inside them. An awakening they did not choose. A clarity they never wanted. It's the moment they look at you and they don't see pain. They don't see you waiting. They don't see you looping in self-blame. They don't see you hoping they return. They see you peaceful. You are living your life, and they stand outside it, watching, no longer the center of your emotional universe. And that touches the deepest fear of the avoidant. They are no longer central to anyone. The most painful thing isn't rejection. The most painful thing is losing influence. Because once all they had to do was go silent and you would run back. Withdraw and you would shrink to keep them. Turn off and you would find the switch. But now silence is no longer an invitation. It's just emptiness. And you are no longer afraid of it. The avoidant is now forced into a strange state. No one is knocking, so they must hear their own echo. This is what your pursuit never achieved. Because when you chased, they could blame you for suffocating them. But when you're peaceful, they have no story left to hide behind. For the first time, they must look at themselves. Not because you demanded it, but because there is no one left to carry their disorientation. And so the question rises within them. If he divided by she can be happy without me, then who am I actually? As you gently return to your own life, they begin to face the very question they spent decades avoiding. Where does my worth come from, if not from being needed? This is a different kind of unraveling, not in action, but in identity. And the irony is, you didn't do anything. You're just living, not performing healing, but actually healed. Your peace says more than any speech. It wakes them to a truth nothing and no one could explain for them. They lost someone who once touched them with real love and they didn't know how to hold it. Not through power, not through anger, but through sovereignty. And this for the avoidant is the deepest reminder. There is an inner life they have not yet lived. Sign 7. When they realize you've truly disappeared, not out of anger, but out of healing, there's a kind of leaving that doesn't slam the door. No final text. No unfinished questions. No one left waiting for an answer. You're just not there anymore. And the avoidant for the first time feels a strange kind of loss. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet absence of the one who used to carry the emotional rhythm of it all. But they don't understand why it feels so heavy. They have no language for this. They don't realize that their emotional stability once depended on the simple fact that you were still there, still loved them, still trying to pull them closer. Now you don't need them. You don't text. You don't wait. You don't scan for signals. You're no longer trying to stay because you've found reasons to live for yourself. And that's what they were never prepared for. You no longer exist in their mind as the one who might come back. You've stepped out of the healer role. And you didn't leave to punish, you left to come home to yourself. For the avoidant, this is baffling. They assumed the connection would always be there, a place they could return to whenever they wanted. An invisible anchor they didn't cherish, but also never thought would vanish. Now, that anchor's gone, not because you're mad, but because you've healed enough to no longer need that role in their life. And that's when the real emptiness appears. Not the emptiness of no more messages, but the emptiness of a presence that cannot be replaced. You were the one who saw them behind the walls, the one who stayed when they pushed you away, the one who gave more chances than made sense. And now, you're not doing that anymore. Not because you're cold, but because you've learned love cannot be a one-person performance. You can't carry the absence of two people with one heart. They may go on as if nothing happened. No apology, no acknowledgement, but inside, they begin to feel what they've avoided all along. The true loss of someone who no longer needs them. And that is your freedom. Not because they changed, but because you no longer need them to in order to live fully. That's when you've truly left. Not just the relationship, but the cycle of fixing. You're not the one staying to hope they grow. You're the one who grew first and chose not to wait. In the end, you realize it wasn't because they changed. It wasn't because they apologized. It wasn't because they finally saw your worth. It was because you found your peace and chose to stay there. These 7 signs are not trophies. They are quiet mile markers on your journey of reclaiming your energy step by step, moment by moment, without drama. When you stop chasing, when you stop needing to prove yourself, when silence no longer made you anxious, when you no longer needed their validation to feel whole, when you could stand in your light not to be seen, but to simply be, that wasn't the end of a relationship. It was the beginning of your real self. The avoidant may never change. They may still run, still freeze, still avoid naming their feelings. But you're no longer waiting. Not because you've hardened, but because you've finally loved yourself the way you once hoped they would love you. You are no longer their healer. You've become your own. Not from anger, but from awakening. Real healing doesn't come from someone returning with an apology. It comes from the moment you no longer need them to. You've stopped needing closure. You've started building a life where you don't return to roles that keep you small. And this is the ultimate message of this journey. You don't need to win to be free. You only need to no longer need them to feel valuable. From that moment on, you don't belong to emotional tug of war or distance used to control. You belong to your own sacred center, where your presence isn't to be chosen, but to choose yourself.